You're listening to Intentionally Catholic, a podcast about living our Catholic faith with joy and intention.
Hello, everyone. This is Dan Hansen, and you're listening to Intentionally Catholic, a podcast about living our Catholic faith more deeply and more intentionally. As always, I'm joined by Father Ron Hutchinson, rector of the Basilica of St. Adalbert. And Father, last time we talked about forgiveness. You know, what it is, why it's critical, how our willingness to forgive affects the manner in which we're forgiven. All of that is good stuff. It's all good stuff. But there really probably aren't too many Christians out there, probably aren't too many people out there who would question whether forgiving others is important or not. We kind of get that part. The problem is that it can be so tough. Now, I know that you've compiled some practical steps that we can take to help us forgive others more readily and more deeply, and I want to just jump right into that. How can we better practice forgiveness in our own lives?
Well, I guess I would start by saying that we have to acknowledge the hurt first and foremost. We have to acknowledge that we're hurt and not try to dismiss that hurt, that somehow forgiveness is about saying, oh, that hurt doesn't exist anymore. No, acknowledge the hurt, own the hurt, give it to God, but by saying, acknowledging what it really is and what it's done to you, okay? And because the only way you're going to be able to heal is by first saying, this is real and this is what it is, okay? Then the second thing I would say really needs to happen is you have to take your mind off the person who you can't forgive, okay? And what I mean by that is if you keep dwelling on this, guess what? You're not going to forgive them. You're going to keep it up. Okay. So literally you have to, you've got to say, I can't continue to grumble about this or justify my anger with others or feel sorry for myself or dream about ways to get even. I have to just kill all of those thoughts as soon as they come into my mind. I have to just move them out.
Yeah. And that's definitely an act of the will. It's something that we're going to have to keep front and center as we progress through this, because it's going to be waves of this. Some days where it's going to be really heavy, other days little bits. But even those little bits, I think we'll have to weed out because they grow to the bigger waves if we don't weed those out. Yeah.
All the weeds of this have to be constantly weeded out. It's just like your garden. If you let the little ones go, they're going to become big ones. So even if it's just a little bit of this, you're coming up and thinking of this person and you feel that anger start, it's like, okay, why are you thinking about that person?
So you brought up the analogy of the garden, and that makes perfect sense. What do you think? I mean, you see a lot of this. You counsel people, you talk to people. With a garden, I don't think there's an end in sight. The weeds never stop coming. Sometimes, if you keep up on it, they're easier to deal with. Do you think this ever eventually goes away?
Yes, I do. I do. And where I'm going to say that this is possible is first we have to seek the desire to forgive, okay, which means that's only going to come from God. Seek the desire to forgive, okay? And we have to really decide we want to forgive then, okay? And that's, again, an act of the will, God, you gave me the desire, and now I have to act with this desire.
Is that the order? Is there an order? Is it sometimes the will first, then the desire?
I think you have to go to God first for the desire, then create the will from the desire. Okay.
Okay. So
because the will isn't going to happen without the desire first.
So I don't have to feel it. I don't have to be all gushy inside, like, oh boy, I'm Mr. Forgiveness here.
First off, that isn't real forgiveness. I mean, that's just like if it's about a feeling, it's not going to be forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a feeling. Forgiveness is an act of the will, a choice, okay? It is a choice. And so, and then it's the recognition that really this is part of your constant prayer. You're only going to heal with the help of God. You're not going to do this on your own, okay? I'm going to go back to a phrase I probably have used before, and if I haven't, then this is the first time, okay? And I promise that I will use it again. But we have to pray as if it all depends upon God, and work as if it all depends upon ourselves. I know I've said that before, haven't I?
Yeah.
I know.
It's a St. Augustine thing, right?
Yeah, but it's so true. And we forget that. We sort of think that we can do it. I can do this. Well, first off, whatever gave us the thought that we could do this on our own without God? We can't do anything without God. We can't love without God. We can't live without God. We can't forgive without God. Okay? So it just comes down to it's going to have to be part of your constant prayer about always desiring to forgive and having the grace to empower the ability to forgive. Okay? And it really is about not nursing anything that's going to be against God's mercy. Okay? Which is the other piece I think we have to remember is, remember that you're a sinner too. So if that person that you've got to forgive, you're saying, well, I can't believe they did this. Okay, they're a sinner. Why did you expect anything different of anybody? People are going to hurt us at various times because they're sinners. And guess what? We're going to hurt people at times because we're sinners. So that's got to be part of this whole puzzle too. Like, what makes me believe that I'm not going to have sins that affect me from other people? Because my sins are affecting other people. Somehow we forget that, by the way.
We do. We forget that. And I think another component that I forget, I'm in the confessional and, sinning against an infinite God. I mean, the smallest sin, is an infinite sin in that regard because the person I'm offending is an infinite being. And so I'm bringing these sins that I think of as, boy, I'm doing a good job that I'm confessing these little things, look at me weeding these little things out. And yet from God's perspective, these are major issues, right? Because I've offended an infinite being. And then I think about the things that I hold against other people and how tiny those are in perspective. And yet I'm so expecting God's forgiveness, presuming upon it, honestly, and yet so often refusing to even think about dishing it out sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that's the other piece I come back to, and I'm sure that we talked about this last time. It's hard to remember sometimes between these.
You're older too, and that doesn't help you
I'm
at
older.
all.
I forget things very easily, but the forgiveness concept is because God has forgiven us. We're called to forgive, okay? And we won't be forgiven if we're not willing to forgive. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Plain and simple, I'm of the firm belief, I said this before, if we don't forgive, we're not going to be forgiven. God is going to say, you withheld, I wanted to forgive you, but you had no ability to receive forgiveness because you can't give forgiveness.
Well, you mentioned last time too the biblical the passage where it talks about the measure with which we measure with
will be given to us.
Man,
yeah.
I like to try to keep that in mind. I'm trying to keep that in mind anytime something comes up like this.
It's really interesting. If you look at a lot of cultures throughout history, they've always had this being or God that weighed your soul or your heart at the end of time. And it was weighed, and people would freak out because they were like, okay, now I'm really scared because I know what was on my heart. So it's really the challenge of that is if you want this, you also have to be willing to give this.
And yeah, like you said, like we said last week, you just said it now, Jesus said this. You're not making this up. It's not just some works theology. And you're not saving yourself by forgiving others. That's not what's happening here, but you are.
That's not the case, but we cannot accept something we can't give. That's just, if we can't accept love, we can't give love. If we can't give love, we can't accept love. They go both ways. It's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so I think we forget that sometimes. We think it's somehow because we're very self-absorbed beings at times, we can think about our need for forgiveness, but we can't think about our need to give other people forgiveness.
Right. No, I see that. And I think honestly, as we're talking, the little bell is going off in my head. I think that in both of our minds, I only know what's in my mind. I'm assuming from what I'm hearing, this is maybe what's in yours too. We're kind of focusing our eyesight, our thoughts on smaller scale things, But there are people out there who have had horrible, horrible, horrible experiences. How do
they
you
have.
get past that? It's so much different.
I would like to share a story, okay? And I was reminded of this when I was doing a little bit of research, trying to come up with these points, and make sure that I wasn't going off on my own tangent, that really what I'm saying is kind of what a lot of people say about forgiveness, okay? So I'm not coming up with any new ideas, trust me, okay? But I was reminded of the story of Corrie Ten Boom, who grew up in Holland during World War II. Her family had been in hiding, had been a hiding place for Jews. And one day they were all discovered, okay, which meant her and her family were all taken to a concentration camp. Her sister and her father died there, but due to some kind of, and I don't know any other way to call it, but a clerical error, okay, she herself was released, okay? But rather than holding a grudge, nursing a grudge, she spent the rest of her life preaching about God's mercy and the importance of forgiveness. She liked to say that when we confess our sins, it's like God throws them out into the deepest ocean and then posts a sign that says, "No fishing allowed." I love that. I think that's really kind of cool. I think what is reality here is that, yes, it's not to say that she didn't have or wasn't filled with a great deal of hate, okay? And it was easy for it to come back to her. She could. Because there's even a time that she saw a man who was one of the guards at the camp, and she was just flooded by these feelings of hatred. And he came up to her smiling, saying that he had found Jesus and he was a changed man. And isn't it wonderful? You're so right. He casts our sins to the bottom of the sea, but I have wanted to be forgiven by someone who was right in front of me. And he put out his hand and said, "Will you forgive me, Fraulein?" Okay? And she then was frozen. Could she forgive? Did she want to forgive? Was she capable? And she said that she remembered that Jesus said, "If you do not forgive others, I will not forgive you." And she thought about Jesus dying on the cross. And here he's condemned to death, and he can even forgive everyone around him, like you said last time, in a multitude of pain. And she then looked at the man and said, "If he could forgive, I can forgive. I forgive you." It wasn't that she didn't experience once again that hurt and that pain, but even in the midst of the hurt and pain, she had to will herself to say, I cannot hang on to this.
And I think it's really important to stress that that's the beginning of that journey for her, with forgiving that gentleman, that man.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't just, okay, I did it, I'm over that hump now.
No,
that's just
she had to do it again and again
right.
and again. And I think that's the thing. Somehow we believe that one and done here, like, okay, done with that, let's move on. That's not going to be the reality, okay? We're going to have to come back to it again and forgive that person again and make the choice again. And yes, we're going to say to ourselves, is this ever going to end? And you pointed it out just a few minutes ago. No, it's like weeds. They're going to pop back up again. It's going to pop back up. Maybe less each year, but it's still something's going to make it pop back up. It may not even be that person that did that to you. Another person is going to push that button. And you're going to feel all that you felt about that other circumstance all over again.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I hadn't thought about that, but that can restart everything, can't it?
It can restart everything. And so we have to recognize that this is a lifelong process. It's not one and done, simple, over, I can move on now. It's not that forgive and forget stuff, okay? There's no such thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no such thing.
You said last week it's too saccharine. That idea is too saccharine. And what I was talking about earlier, you said the touchy-feely, the feelings. If we're looking for that, that's too shallow. We got to.
Oh, yeah.
And it's too hard. I think that makes it too hard for us. If I'm looking for touchy-feely feelings towards this person that hurt me, I can convince myself, if that's what I think forgiveness is, I can convince myself I'm not forgiving. And I don't have to get those touchy-feely feelings. And that's a good thing to me. I can try to make the choice, and then I can turn it over to God and ask him to help me get through it, and to not want, not think angrily of that person, to not want bad for that person, to love that person as best I can from whatever distance I have to. Mm-hmm. Those things are honestly more reasonable to me than trying to convince my heart that I have touchy-feely feelings.
And that I have to go hold hands with the person and
kumbaya, and sing that, right?
Kumbaya and go through my entire life dancing and singing with them. No, that isn't what Jesus is asking of us. Okay, he said you're giving someone forgiveness means I am not going to hang on to this hurt. I'm not going to let this hurt become me. Become who I am. And that's what most people that hang on to hurt, it turns into revenge. Their whole lives are colored by it. I mean, quite honestly, if you think about it, somebody that's like that, or even just a little bit like that, it's all they talk about. That's all they talk about. If that issue comes up again, or somehow it gets brought into the conversation, it's like we're back there all over again. Instead of saying, I'm just not even going to engage this.
And it's so hard. It's nothing's meant, God never said it was going to be easy. And that's what he's here to help us do. But yeah, I understand why people do that. I've had situations where I've done that, where it's just, honestly, I think there's some chemical that goes off in your head that almost feeds it, helps, it feels good to feel sorry for yourself, I think.
We like to be victims at times. And I'm not saying that we aren't victims, but there's a difference between being a victim and living like a victim. Okay. Being victimized in a sense. Okay. I think the problem is when we take on that victimization mentality, we think we have a right to remain angry and upset and belligerent and whatever other terms you want to use. Okay. We are allowed. And the problem with that is if everybody is allowed to be victimized by whatever things, we're just going to have a bunch of angry people running around. Because it doesn't just affect that situation, it affects us as people. It changes us. And it's a very thing that the evil one wants of us. He wants us to harbor grudges and revenge and negativity and all of that, because then he's won.
Well, and you mentioned last week, and I'm thinking of that with this Corrie Ten Boom story and, the Nazi that she encounters. I guess he did specifically ask for her forgiveness. So had she not given it out, he would have known that she wasn't giving him that forgiveness. But in a lot of our situations, the people that we're mad at don't realize it. The only people that are affected by this really are us and the people directly around us, who really experience that. And granted,
yes, we don't have to have a person ask us to forgive them for them to receive our forgiveness, okay? We never have to encounter them again to give them forgiveness, okay? We don't have to say those words like, I've forgiven you, We can just do it, okay? And I think when we make it about I've got to have this reconciling moment with this person. No, we're not asking for reconciliation. We're asking for forgiveness.
All right.
Okay?
So quickly, difference, reconciliation versus forgiveness.
Reconciliation is an attempt to repair the damage in a relationship. Okay. But interestingly enough, notice Jesus doesn't say that you and I have to reconcile with every single person who's hurt us. He doesn't say that. He says we have to forgive. Forgiveness is more important to changing ourselves, I think to some extent the reconciling happens eventually. Now, it may mean when I say reconciliation, I'm not saying like, oh, you've become good friends again, or you want to engage with this person in exactly the same way that you did. But I'm saying it's a reconciliation that says, I can just go on about life, and I don't need this to be a part of me anymore.
Sure.
It may be a reconciliation that says that if that person even comes in the room, I can handle it. But that's going to take possibly for some people years of forgiveness. Okay. But forgiveness does not imply that the person who's hurt me and I have to sit down together and have this one-on-one.
And that's probably the biggest takeaway, or one of the huge takeaways from all of this conversation, is just that understanding what forgiveness really looks like, what God's expecting from us, why God's asking it. It's not, yes, of course, it plays out that we're forgiven in the manner in which we forgive. We've talked about that over and over again, but primarily God's worried about us. It affects us in a major way. He wants relationships, not messed up by all this hate and anger. Like you said, that only pleases the evil one. So it's not, we're not looking for the touchy-feely feelings. I got to remember that. I can make the act of the will, turn it over to God, and ask for the grace that I need to continue to make that an act of the will.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the theologian, said. His way of looking at it was to say, forgiveness is the Christ-like suffering, which is the Christian's duty to share in. That's what Christ had to do. Christ, was constantly forgiving. Didn't mean that it was reconciled. I mean, he didn't reconcile with all the Jewish authorities. He didn't reconcile with every person who called him a name, on the way to Golgotha. But when you and I are willing to forgive, we share in his suffering in some sense. We're part of what he experienced.
Well, he asked us to take up our cross and follow him.
Exactly.
That's all part of it.
It's not going to be fun.
No, I wish the cross was more fun. That'd make it easier, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, but it's just the very fact that we knew it was used as a Roman torture tool means it wasn't fun.
Exactly. Was there anything else on your list?
No, I think that's everything that I have. I mean, interestingly enough, there's a great practicality to forgiving. Okay, it's not something that requires therapy. It's not something that requires, money. It's not something that requires even, a special kind of gift in a sense, other than God's grace, but we all can forgive. We all have the ability to do it. Okay. Especially those of us who say, I'm a follower of Christ, because we have an image to keep before us. And now I want to say carefully here and very distinctly, I understand Jesus was God and he was infinitely perfect. And I am not infinitely perfect. You're not infinitely perfect, and neither is anybody who's listening to us, okay? But that doesn't mean that we can't keep before us an image of the infinitely perfect to strive toward. The problem that we often do is with Jesus is we turn him into, or we do this with saints sometimes too, we turn them into something so other than ourselves that we say, well, see, this just isn't possible. This isn't possible. And I say, I'll remind us once again, everything's possible with God. Everything's possible with God. It's not possible by ourselves, but it's possible with God.
And it all starts with that first step and just trying to be willing to look into what forgiveness might look like in our lives. And then at that point, turning it over to God.
And asking God for the desire to forgive that then can be built upon, Nature builds upon grace. Grace builds upon nature.
Well, we know it's not easy, but God's here to help us. Jesus did it. Jesus is asking us to follow him. And that's just part of the process. And we don't have to nail it on the first one. We don't have to nail it on our 5th, 6th, 20th year of this. It's just a process. God gets it, and he'll bring us along the way.
Be willing to be engaged in the process.
Well, thanks for listening, everybody. I think we're going to wrap this one up. Let us know your thoughts. The email is coming up in the outro. For Intentionally Catholic, I'm Dan Hansen.
And I'm Father Ron Hutchinson. God bless.
Thanks for listening to Intentionally Catholic. If you like what you heard, please consider sharing our show with a friend. If you have comments, questions, or topics you'd like to hear discussed, please email those to comments@icatholic.show. And be sure to tune in next time for another episode.